Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is our class for Monday, the 31st, where I wanted to talk a little bit about Shakespearean biography and then move to Shakespearean stage and then finally talk a little bit about upcoming assignments like sonnets and journals. And where we left off last class is I had you watch a documentary that talked a little bit about Shakespeare's authorship question. And obviously, the documentary has bias, which I hope you were able to identify. I was able to read your responses to the discussion forum, and I responded to all of you. So while you don't have to respond to your peers, I do ask that you read your peer responses as well as ultimately read my responses. And if you decide you do want to respond to your peers, then certainly you can. It would be very similar to your raising your hand in class if you decided that you wanted to add some commentary. But your response on that discussion forum would serve as your attendance, in effect, for that particular class. And as I indicated to some of you, that you can probably guess from my responses that I don't necessarily believe in this conspiracy theory that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare. That said, we don't have definitive proof that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, but we also don't have definitive proof that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare. In other words, we need to move to the texts themselves because we can never know for certain. But the fact that Shakespeare didn't have higher education, I don't think has much meaning when we're talking about the idea of genius. And I don't think genius is something that can be taught in a classroom. The fact that there are different spellings, for instance, of his signature, I don't think has much validity either, because oftentimes many words were spelled differently by individuals, and there really wasn't standardization in the way that we think of standardization today. There wasn't a definitive dictionary, for instance. And the fact that there was little documentation about Shakespeare, I don't think holds a whole lot of validity, because ultimately they didn't keep documentation in the way that they do now. Now, granted, there are other individuals for which there is greater documentation, and we could talk about individuals who were involved in the court, such as Edward de Vere, and that's another theory that he perhaps wrote these plays because he was familiar with the court. Another theory is that perhaps Queen Elizabeth wrote these plays and had to take a pseudonym because she wouldn't be allowed, because of her gender and her social status, to admit that she was involved with writing plays. Because at the time, play acting and playwriting was seen as somewhat of an unsavory occupation and event. Luckily for us, though, the Queen enjoyed going to the theater, which meant that ultimately the theater flourished during this time period. That's why it's known as the Renaissance, which is rebirth or renewal of the arts. She was a very strong patron of the arts. I suspect if she hadn't have been, we probably would not have the body of work that we do today from that period, and certainly not from Shakespeare himself. So in some ways there was a society that it seemed to be rather contradictory, but then we live in contradictory times right now, so I don't think that's that unusual that something could be seen as perhaps unsavory, and yet all individuals at the time would be involved in the theater in one way or another. It was the television of the day, and basically rich and poor and young and old and educated and non-educated all attended the theater. And that meant that a dramatist needed to write for multiple levels of individuals. So we will see this in the plays and somewhat in the sonnets as well, that they have multiple levels of interpretation and multiple levels of meaning associated with them, which I think again attests to Shakespeare's genius. One of the interesting things about Shakespeare is that his texts were preserved, because at the time there wasn't copyright in the way that we think of copyright today. But 7 years after his death, his peers put together what was known as a folio, which happens to be a printing term when you take a large sheet of paper and you fold it once. And they tried to the best of their ability to document all of Shakespeare's plays and writings. That said, obviously Shakespeare wasn't there because it had occurred 7 years after his death. So they try to reconstruct to the best of their ability, and that's known as the folio. Now, during the time period, even though plays weren't copyrighted necessarily, there were ways to get printed versions of the plays. Usually these were bootleg versions that you could get almost in the way that you would get, let's say, bootleg media today. Let's say a CD, if you were going to think about how in the past individuals were able to get a hold of things like films before they were released to the public, let's say. Or if you were looking to get a film at a reduced price, you could get a bootleg CD. Of course, this is all before streaming. What you could do is you could hire someone to try to reconstruct the play for you. And they would put together a version that was known as a quarto. And this is another printing term, but if you know Spanish, you know cuatro, which means four. And basically what that meant is that that large sheet of paper, rather than folded once, the way it would be for the folio, was folded twice. So it was in quarters or cuatros. And it looked kind of like a paperback book. And you could hire either a bit player in the company to try to reconstruct and think about all of the challenges involved with that, because probably actors learned their roles and not necessarily the roles of others. And if somebody had a minor role, they might be perhaps tempted to remember their role as being a little bit more grandiose if they were reconstructing the play. Or you could hire somebody to sit in the audience and to try to transcribe. Think about the difficulty involved in that. So what modern day editors do is when they are looking at a play, they try to compare the folio, that version that was put together by Shakespeare's contemporaries, and all of the quarto versions that may exist or that at least have been found at this point. And then what editors try to do is they try to attempt to reconstruct the definitive version. But even that is uncertain. So if you're ever reading a Shakespearean play, for instance, and you happen to see something like a square bracket inside of the dialogue, well, a square bracket is a piece of punctuation that's used to indicate when an individual is adding in their own thoughts within a quotation. So if we ever see a square bracket in Shakespearean text, what this means is that this is the editor inserting in a word or several words. In other words, there's dispute about what would have appeared there. Occasionally, you will also have editors give something like a footnote that will appear with a question mark. And this is the editor's best guess as to what that particular word would mean in that particular context. Again, language, certainly things like spelling, hadn't been standardized in the way that it's standardized now. Individuals oftentimes created words. Shakespeare, in fact, is credited with creating quite a few words. Some were never used again. Some have become part of our popular language. So as we will talk about in further depth, many of us are quoting from Shakespeare and not even realizing that we're quoting from Shakespeare, because some of the language of Shakespeare has become so commonplace that it's become cliche almost in our language. And that said, when we read some of the plays, you'll see some of those terms. So if you've ever heard something like "The course of true love never did run smooth," that is a quote from A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is going to be the first play that we are going to be reading this semester. Or "Jealousy's that green-eyed monster," that'll get us to Othello, for instance. But in terms of the quartos and the folios, I mention them because there is dispute about the actual language of the plays themselves as much as there is dispute about Shakespearean biography. In other words, we've got a good number of unanswered questions. Usually what you read at the undergraduate level are the plays that have very little controversy associated with them. That there are very few questions about the construction of the plays and the accuracy of the text of the plays. But there are some plays that are known as problem plays because they serve as just that, problems, and that there are so many huge discrepancies between the folio and the quarto versions that exist that there's uncertainty as to the definitive text. And going back to Christopher Marlowe, in fact, this is what I did my graduate work on Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus, a very famous play, which happens to be about a scholar who sells his soul to the devil for infinite knowledge, and he ends up squandering that knowledge. Basically, it's based on the German Faust legend. But in terms of Christopher Marlowe, and of course we saw that this documentary had a very strong bias about Christopher Marlowe perhaps being the author of these plays. But if we had seen another documentary, we would have gotten another perspective of that. In fact, I've even heard the idea that a committee wrote these plays. And I don't know about you if you've ever served on a committee, but committees can't find time to meet, let alone to write 30 plus plays and keep it a secret. So I think that's rather outlandish. But Christopher Marlowe is an interesting figure because he wasn't necessarily a playwright. He was a spy of the Queen, and he wrote plays in his spare time. So if you like conspiracy theories, this is ripe for a conspiracy theory, especially because Marlowe died young. He was murdered in a tavern brawl, supposedly over a dispute about money. And again, if individuals want to have some sort of a conspiracy theory, they could argue that he needed to be in a kind of witness protection program, so to speak, from the Queen. So he needed to go underground and take on a new identity. And that identity would have been William Shakespeare. And then he continued to do what he did well, which was write, but that ultimately the writing grew more sophisticated and more complex because he could devote himself full time to writing rather than doing it part time, which is what he was doing when he was a spy. And of course, with additional practice and time, his skills developed as well. It makes a great story for a film, but I don't know necessarily if there's accuracy there. But I think that the authorship question and some of the controversy associated with the plays is important for us to establish before we actually begin some of Shakespeare's writings. I also wanted to talk about the theater because ultimately dramas are meant to be performed, which is why we are going to be watching performances. This was something that served as entertainment for the populace, but also for intellectual stimulation. Again, it appealed to all levels of education and all levels of social backgrounds. Including what were known as the Groundlings or the Stinkers. And the reason why they were called the Groundlings is because they, with the least expensive tickets, could not purchase seats. They had to actually stand on the ground and watch the performance. And they were called stinkers because that's exactly what they did. They stank. Hygiene was questionable during this time period for all social classes. The old joke, and I'm not so sure if it really was a joke, is that Queen Elizabeth took a bath once a year, whether she needed it or not. The irony is that these individuals who were exposed to the elements because the theaters were open air theaters and were uncomfortable because they weren't able to sit were also closest to the stage, so perhaps they had the best view. It almost reminds me of modern day concerts where if you are in the front row, there is a likelihood that you are not going to be seated, you're going to stand. And what that's going to result in is everybody else behind you standing as well because they can't see. I've never quite understood that phenomenon. But the stinkers or the groundlings, because the stage jutted outward, had a sense of connection and intimacy with the actors that many of the others didn't. And the other seats were covered so they could be protected somewhat against the elements. And based on one's ability to pay, that would determine a seat based on the ability to see the stage well, unobstructed. And in fact, those individuals who had additional monies could even purchase something like a cushion for their seat so that they could be more comfortable. All of this begins with medieval theater, where there were traveling wagons that would go from community to community and dramatize biblical stories. And as the stories became more and more dramatized, they became less about religion and more about the human condition. And there was oftentimes a good amount of humor associated with them, and well as some social commentary too. The difficulty with performing in this manner is that it's very difficult to be able to gather an audience, and certainly it's difficult to be able to gather payment from such an audience, which was why theater houses were built. And probably the most famous theater house is known as the Globe Theater, which was Shakespeare's theater, but there were several open air theaters that existed in England. They're circular with a thatched roof and plaster walls, and again, we're seen as somewhat seedy. Oftentimes, in their off hours, they would be used for things like bear baiting events. And actually, there are two versions of the globe. The first one was destroyed by a fire. The way the story goes is that a cannon was shot and it happened to set fire to the thatched roof. And the result is that the theater burned down. No one was hurt, but again, according to some of the stories, there was one individual who needed to put out the fire on his pants with some ale. And ale would have been the beverage of the time because water would have been very unsanitary because people were using the waterways basically for their sanitary needs. So that said, the second globe was built this time with a tiled roof, which is a smart thing to do. If you are from the West Coast in California, for instance, you understand the importance of having a tiled roof so that you can prevent fire. And after Shakespeare's death, the Puritans basically tore down that theater, saying that it was evil and that it helped to theater in general. It helped to promote all kinds of vices. Again, Queen Elizabeth wouldn't have been there at the time in order to protect the theaters, she being a very strong patron of the arts. And it stayed that way for quite a long time until about the 1970s or so. There was an American actor by the name of Sam Wanamaker, a small bit actor, who visited England with the intent of visiting the Globe Theater. He was quite surprised to find that there was no theater, just a plaque that had said, "This is where the Globe Theater stood." And as he found out more about the Globe Theater and how it was torn down by the Puritans, he made it his lifelong mission to reconstruct that Globe Theater. And at first, no one took him very seriously. He didn't have financing. He wasn't even British. He was an American. But lo and behold, he was able to do it. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the opening of this reconstructed Globe Theater, just steps away from where the original would have stood. And this theater is now a venue for performances of Shakespearean plays, as well as other performances as well. So the first play we are going to be discussing and watching in class is A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the performance that I wanted to show you actually took place in that reconstructed Globe Theater. So you'll be able to see for yourself what this open air theater looked like. Of course, they made some changes to it so that they could satisfy some of the building codes of the time. So there are things like restrooms and fire exits and so forth that wouldn't have existed during Shakespeare's time. You'll be able to see that stage that juts out, and you'll be able to see the Groundlings. Now that has become the most popular place to be in the reconstructed Globe Theater, is to be a Groundling, so you can stand right next to the stage. The stage would have a trap door where you could have an actor descend down into something like hell, or you could have an actor ascend upwards, for instance, to something like heaven, and there would be overhead stage machinery as well. Oftentimes it's known as Deus ex machina, God in the machine, and this is a way that you would have a certain level of special effect, or as many special effects as possible during this time period without a Steven Spielberg and the magic of Hollywood. And the special effects of the time would oftentimes include things like cannons being shot. As I had indicated, that's what led to the original fire. Or fireworks being set off. In fact, there's this old story with a performance of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, where at one point Dr. Faustus is engaged in a spell trying to conjure the devil. And at least according to the story, the actors ran off stage frightened and refusing to perform further, saying that as they were acting out the conjuring scene of the devil with fireworks and smoke, they had actually conjured a spirit. I can only imagine what this would do for ticket sales once they decided to resume performances. So I suspect that there was a little bit of showmanship here. Again, I certainly wasn't a witness to be able to tell you. The performances were usually held in the afternoon, and it makes sense, again, if you've got an open air theater. And because theater was seen as somewhat unsavory, you couldn't even properly advertise for it. So instead, a flag would be flown to indicate that a performance was occurring. It almost reminds me of modern day businesses, where oftentimes they will put out, let's say, an open sign that is a flag, or perhaps it could just actually be a sign. But that flag that they flew, and this would have been at the top of the stage so that it could be seen from a distance, the color would denote the kind of play that was being shown. So if it was black, then it would mean that a tragedy was being performed. If it was white, it would mean that a comedy was being performed. So there were some unusual conventions of the theater that helped to influence the actual performance of the plays. Very few props on stage, but the costumes were oftentimes very elaborate, in part because clothing during the time of the Renaissance was very important to denote social station, much more so than it is today. So the type of fabric worn or the color worn would oftentimes be connected with a particular class. So we will definitely see that sense when we watch A Midsummer Night's Dream being performed in the reconstructed globe. And again, keep in mind that we've got little information about Shakespeare and some controversy about the actual plays he wrote, and also not as much information as we would like about the Globe Theater. So that when it was reconstructed at the time, it used the most recent scholarship of the day. I remember my own experience when I first started graduate school, and this would have been, well, I won't tell you how many years ago, but at any rate, I remember that we were going on a tour in UCLA, and we were shown a reconstructed model of the Globe Theater, or a model of the reconstructed Globe Theater, and we were told that basically there were all kinds of errors based on recent scholarship. And at least based on the actors who have performed in this reconstructed Globe Theater, what they've indicated is that from their perspective, that stage is too large, that they don't see how actors at the time would have had a stage that would be that large, that would feel comfortable for the actual performance. So again, there are questions about theater, just like there are questions about biography, and there are questions about the text. But at least we've got a general sense of all three. Of Shakespeare, who's probably the son of a glove maker who married young, and less than 9 months later had his first child, which might explain why there was a hurried announcement in the church records. And the records we have of Shakespeare basically are legal records, things like baptismal records and death certificates. We're not even necessarily sure how Shakespeare died. And that said, I think that what's most important is that we have the actual text itself. And the theaters oftentimes needed to be closed for plague. And perhaps we can understand that considering the current challenges that we're living in today. The concern was that large gatherings would promote the spreading of disease. It wasn't understood at the time that the Black Plague was spread through fleas on rats. They were concerned that it was airborne, so they would close the theater sometimes for months at a time. And it was during this time that we think that Shakespeare spent his time writing his very famous sonnets, his short poems, which is how we are going to begin the semester, is talking about his sonnets before we get to A Midsummer Night's Dream, because I thought the sonnets would serve as a nice introduction to Renaissance English, which is very similar to the English we speak today, but yet there are also some differences. And oftentimes this happens to be an anxiety of students when they're first introduced to Shakespeare. It's about the language. I've oftentimes said, almost like a foreign language that 90 or 95% of. It's a question of just getting accustomed to the rhythms. And these rhythms are probably going to be much more much clearer to you by the ending of the semester after you've had some experience with them, but you are going to have some experience with them. And Shakespeare oftentimes wrote in a 10-syllable line. It's known as iambic pentameter. And it sounds like dum bum, bum bum, bum bum, bum bum. Almost like a heartbeat. And scholars have actually done some work saying that is one of the reasons for Shakespeare's appeal, though there are multiple reasons for Shakespeare's appeal, is that his language has a rhythm to it that's very natural, a rhythm that we were all exposed to in the womb, the sound of the heartbeat. Sometimes it was rhymed, sometimes it was unrhymed. When we think about unrhymed iambic pentameter, that's the 10-syllable line with stress and unstress. And then we will see that in Shakespearean plays. And the plays have a 5-act structure. They act almost like a pyramid. So the first act, which would be on the lower left side of the pyramid, would be an introduction to characters. And then we would begin to see an ascent of action. This is where conflict would begin. And then we would hit the tip of the pyramid. That would be Act 3. That would be the height of tension and conflict. Then we begin to get descent. That's Act 4. And then finally we get resolution, and that would be the other end of the bottom of the pyramid. And that would be Act 5. So you could sort of predict the action that would be occurring within the plays. And you can also predict some of the content of the plays based on the genre. So comedies had certain criteria that they followed. They were about love, for instance, and all of the misunderstandings associated with love. There would be a good amount of music and dance. The idea is that they were celebratory, and oftentimes they were performed before things like weddings. And they were in many ways almost like contemporary rom-coms, and that we knew we would get a happy ending and there would be no death. That said, even though Shakespeare had to follow a particular criterion, he was still very creative. When we get to the histories, we will talk about the elements associated with history, that they were based on British history of the time. Not just any history, so you couldn't say that Antony and Cleopatra, for instance, was a history, because that wouldn't be British history. Though Shakespeare would take liberties with the British history in order to make his dramatic statements and points. So sometimes knowing the history actually is more challenging when you're reading a play because of the liberties that Shakespeare took. We think that Shakespeare wrote, for the most part, his comedies at the beginning of his career, and then for the most part, the histories afterwards. But again, there is controversy about the dating of the plays, just like there is controversy about many other things. And then we go to the tragedies, which is probably what Shakespeare is best known for. The Hamlet, the Macbeths, the Othellos. We see this as the height of Shakespeare's career. And this would be about a great individual who experiences descent, in part because of their flaws and also because of outside forces. So if you're familiar with Greek tragedy and something like Sophocles' Oedipus the King, then you'll see the parallels with this idea of tragedy. And we'll discuss that when we get there. And expect death and quite a bit of it. And then we think Shakespeare ended his career with the tragic comedies, where he was mixing genres, and there were some pretty dark elements that you would expect to find in a tragedy in these plays, but there would also be very lighthearted elements that you would expect to find in comedies. And in the end, there would be resolution, and there would be no death. And we will be reading representatives of all of those over the course of the semester. And again, when the theaters were closed for plague is when we think that Shakespeare wrote his sonnets. And as we will discuss when we talk more specifically about the sonnets, they too have a very specific structure. 14 lines, and they have a particular rhyme scheme or pattern. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Basically, we use letters of the alphabet to indicate a rhyme. The first letter of the alphabet would indicate the first word of the last word of the first line of a poem that would establish our first rhyme. And anything that rhymed with that would be called an A with that particular word. And then a B rhyme would be the last word of whatever line that had a different rhyme than what was established with the A. And then anything that rhymed with that word would be a B, and so forth and so on with the C. And we'll see this when we read the sonnets, that you'll have a pattern of every other line rhyming. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And then the last two lines, G, G, they rhyme together and they form a kind of couplet, almost as a kind of summary. The sonnets also had to be about serious and lofty themes, things that would be seen as important enough to be writing a poem about: life, love, death, nothing mundane or too much of the ordinary. So this is where we begin to transition away from our introduction of Shakespeare to actually reading some of his works. And I had indicated that I wanted to start with the sonnets, and I selected a handful of sonnets to illustrate some of Shakespeare's writing style. So the sonnets, as you can see in the notes below, and in the notes below, you can also see some major points that I've covered in this video about Shakespearean biography and Shakespearean theaters. We are reading sonnets 15, 18, and 20, the early set of sonnets, and the sonnets didn't have titles, so they were referred to by either their number or they were referred to by the first line. And then in the latter set of sonnets, we're reading 127, 130, and 151. And I thought that those would serve as a good introduction to what was going on with Shakespearean sonnets. And what I'm hopeful is happening is, while you had these couple classes where you didn't have any reading, that you were able to read the sonnets. Certainly, if you have not read these sonnets yet, you should read these sonnets. And my hope is that as we are discussing the sonnets in class, since you've already read them, you can move forward to the next play. And that happens to be, or to our first play, I should say, and that happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. And that ideally you would have completed reading A Midsummer Night's Dream when we first begin to talk about it, so that you can read ahead for the next play, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. And we would continue on from there. But that's an ideal world. I know that sometimes you can't necessarily follow an ideal structure, but you'll see that we have multiple classes devoted to Shakespeare's works, so that we can talk about performance as well as talk about the text itself. As for the text itself, I had indicated that I'm fond of the Riverside Shakespeare because that was the edition that was used with me when I was an undergraduate. But there are many versions of Shakespeare, and as long as you are reading something that has some decent footnotes, because I think the footnotes can be very helpful because they will oftentimes explain words or concepts that might be unfamiliar to a contemporary audience, you're fine. And I know that you can get paperback versions of individual plays. Again, we're not reading all of Shakespeare's plays, but in the syllabus you can see which ones we're reading. There are publishers like Penguin, for instance, that are very well known for having very good editions of Shakespearean plays. And in our notes below, I've also indicated under the section with upcoming readings the link for the Folger Shakespeare. And this is considered to be one of the definitive links for Shakespeare's writings. And you can find all of Shakespeare's plays and his sonnets on this link. There are other sites that you could access as well online to be able to find the text of Shakespearean works. But the Folger Shakespeare Library is considered to be one of the premier Shakespearean libraries on the planet. So you can basically rest assured that if you are using their resources, they are trustworthy, or as trustworthy as exists based on the current scholarship of the time. So you don't necessarily have to have a print text. However, if you've ever had the experience of reading something online as opposed to reading it in print, you've probably come to the conclusion that having a print copy is much more accessible because you can write notes on it, and it's probably easier to be able to find information flipping through pages rather than scrolling through pages online. And for us, the kinds of notes that you might be writing in the margins of not just observations, but also questions, could be things that you could discuss in a journal. And the journals are basically going to be addressing each of Shakespeare's major works, starting with the sonnets. And what I was thinking is that you would write about a page or so for each of Shakespeare's major works, though you could write as much or as little as you'd like. And certainly I encourage you to think about what we've talked about thus far with Shakespeare, and if it seems applicable, certainly you can add that into your journal comments. But your first journal, being on the sonnets, should be focused on the sonnets mostly themselves. That said, the sonnets are going to be a little bit different than what we've talked about, or what we will be talking about with the plays, because the play is one entity as opposed to the sonnets, and we're reading 6 sonnets. So there are different ways that you could go about a journal for this. You could decide to write briefly about each of the 6 sonnets, or you could decide to focus on 2 or 3 sonnets and write more in depth. Or you could decide to focus just on one sonnet and write in depth. Again, I sort of see the sonnets as our introduction to Shakespearean writing, now that we've established biography, and now that we've established some information about the theaters. But that said, there's lots of different ways that you can go about writing the journals, and I'm not going to be evaluating them for grammar or mechanics. Basically, I'm going to be reviewing them for content. And grading them on an informal checkmark scale. But that said, certainly, you want to try your best to be able to write legibly and cohesively. But I'm more interested at this point in the content. When we get to the actual papers, then we can talk a little bit more about the construction of the writing as well as the content of the writing. And I'll talk more a little bit about the sonnets as we continue on next class. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the politics of the day, but I thought I would leave what we've discussed thus far, because I think we've done a good overview thus far with Shakespeare at this point, and ask you for today's attendance question. And this will be due on Wednesday the 2nd at 8 a.m. on our discussion forum. So I had indicated you've got 48 hours to respond to the attendance question. But if you need additional time, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. Thus far, what is the most interesting thing that you've learned about Shakespeare and or his times? Because we've spent a couple of classes trying to develop background. So I'm curious to hear what you have found to be the most interesting thing thus far, whether it be from the documentary or today's class lesson, or some combination of the two. So, as I indicated, we will continue on next class, where I will talk a little bit about Shakespearean politics, and also I will talk about sonnets. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.